The Match is a national bone marrow and stem cell registry, and we try to talk to people and educate them about the need for the registry. It's not really inherently obvious for a lot of people why there's a registry, but there's a lot of people who have various forms of blood cancer or blood diseases, and oftentimes, for whatever reason, more conservative treatments haven't worked, or chemotherapy hasn't worked, or whatever the case, and so then they potentially need a donor. And what that looks like is typically their siblings are tested first. Obviously, the sibling will have about half the genetic makeup as the person in need of a transplant, and they are obviously readily willing to donate. Typically, the sibling is wanting to do anything they can, but oftentimes they are not a 10 out of 10 human leukocyte antigen match, and human leukocyte antigens are just basically these proteins that dictate whether or not your transplant will be received. So that's where we need willing, committed, and able strangers to step in. So that process typically involves them being approached by someone from Be The Match and saying, hey, how about thinking about saving a stranger's life? The process of donating is very accommodating. There's two different ways you can donate. You can donate both by peripheral blood stem cell collection, and that's similar to donating plasma, where you are donating cells from one of your arms, and then they use some sort of centrifuge to spin off the cells that they need, and then they reinfuse the cells back into your other arm. The process can take anywhere from 3 hours to a couple days, depending on how many cells they receive from your donation. The process that a lot of people, I think, are scared about is donating from their pelvis. So that just involves anesthesia, and if you desire, you're completely oblivious to the process, and then they use a long needle to withdraw the liquid marrow from your pelvic bone. And people think that you use a drill, which isn't the case. People think you're awake, which isn't the case. And overall, Be The Match is very accommodating. So when people go to sign up to be one of these willing and able donors, what they do is just fill out a bit of paperwork. The paperwork generally has demographic information in addition to a little bit about your genetic makeup. So we collect that information, and then we send you to the cheek swab station, where we just get a few of your cells from the insides of your cheeks. That process takes only 30 seconds for you to give Be The Match your DNA so that they can have it on file for use later on when they go to potentially find a match for someone. My little brother is a couple of years my junior, but when we were growing up, I was about 11, I think, when he was diagnosed with non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, and I can recall the exact moment that my parents sat my older brother and I down on our family couch and told us that he had cancer, and telling that to an 11-year-old is a bit much. I think they always wanted to be totally honest with what was going on, though, and they assured us that they were going to do everything that they could to save his life, and they did that. He initially had quite a bit of chemotherapy, and we thought that that cured him. It didn't, though. He went on to actually need a stem cell transplant, and both my older brother and I were tested. We just had to give a blood sample to see whether or not our HLA markers were going to be sufficient to match his, and we found out that they weren't. And it was, like I said before, probably one of the worst days of my life. But thankfully, he was able to, because of his form of cancer, have an autologous or self stem cell transplant. So what they do is they take out his cells because the stem cells they needed weren't affected by his cancer. And then they, with every other person receiving a transplant as well, they knock you down to basically no immune system. They use whatever chemotherapy they can, and they use very high doses. And so when you receive the stem cells, if you don't receive them, it's likely that you'll succumb to some sort of infection because you're basically without an immune system. And he went on to thankfully receive that very well, and he's actually a student here at Montana State University, and he's getting his master's in structural engineering. And I'm very fortunate that stem cell transplants were even available. I shadowed his pediatric oncologist a while ago, and he said, I wasn't sure that it was going to work, but by some miracle it did, and he's still with us today because of a stem cell transplant. And I think that had he not been able to get his own stem cells, he would have turned to a similar process that Be The Match coordinates for everyone in need of a stem cell or bone marrow transplant.
My name is John Philpott. I am the Community Engagement Representative for Be The Match and the National Marrow Donor Program in Montana, Idaho, and Utah. Well, in 2012 I was diagnosed with leukemia, and when I was told that my siblings were not a good match for me when I needed a bone marrow transplant, my doctors searched the Be The Match registry, and that was the first time I had ever even heard that there was a marrow donor registry. But after hearing about it and after finding out that a donor had been found for me, and then also learning that that other patients weren't so fortunate to find a donor, my wife and I decided that we wanted to volunteer with Be The Match and hold a marrow donor registry drive and try and educate as many people about marrow donation and encourage as many people as possible to join the registry. When you're only 40 years old and you're told that you have a life-threatening illness and you've got a spouse and 5 young children, it turns your world upside down, and it's very scary. Anyone who tells you otherwise is lying. When you hear your doctor say you have cancer, the immediate thought is, I'm going to die. But then when your doctors tell you that a cure is possible with a bone marrow transplant, hope is immediately infused right back into that otherwise hopeless situation. When my doctors gave me my official diagnosis of plasma cell leukemia, they put it to me very simply. They told me that I could either go through the hell that's a bone marrow transplant or I could die. So I replied, I really don't have 2 options. I only have one, because I'm not ready to check out without a fight. My wife's not ready to be a widowed mother with 5 young kids. The vast majority of donor registry drives that I'm involved with and that I help coordinate are held in honor of a patient who is currently fighting their battle, searching for a match, or they found their match and they just want to pay it forward. I work with a lot of donors who want to sort of share the joy of being a donor with others. Donors are always excited to share their story because they understand that so few people are naturally interested in becoming a donor of anything, unless they're dead. And so I work with a lot of donors who want to share their story and help dispel the myths and misconceptions and help people make educated and well-informed decisions, because they know that when they're well-informed, when a person is well-informed about really what's truly involved in marrow donation, they don't freak out that much. But if they count on what they saw in Chicago Fire or Grey's Anatomy or House, they're going to be freaked out. I would be too. But, so in the nearly 3 years that I've been working with Be The Match, I'm pretty sure I've helped coordinate or run, or both, close to 200 donor registry drives. In March 2009, some students at the University of New Mexico decided to hold a marrow donor registry drive in honor of a patient who was then fighting for her life and searching for a donor for herself. And a young man named Ambrose was walking across campus, and he he listened to what they were saying, and he actually knew the young lady who was fighting for her life and decided to join the registry, not specifically hoping to be her match, but realizing that there were thousands of other people every year who were in her situation. And so he filled out a little paperwork, swabbed his cheek, and went on with his life, and didn't even think about it for the next few years. And then in March 2013, 4 years to the month after Ambrose joined the registry, he received a phone call from Be The Match saying that there was a 40-year-old man with leukemia who would die without a transplant, and that Ambrose had come up as a potential match for that man. And he was asked to give a blood sample to see if he was the best match, and he ended up being the only possible match for that man, and that man was me. So, and at the time he was a single father of a 2-year-old little girl. He was in the Army Reserve. He had already served a few tours in the Middle East, and so while as a soldier he was already everybody's hero in a manner of speaking, he decided to step up to the plate and follow through with the commitment he had made 4 years before, as busy as he was, and become my very, very personal hero. Donor and recipient information is kept anonymous for at least 1 year post-transplant. But then 1 year post-transplant, either the donor or the recipient can request the other's contact information. And rest assured that on my first transplantiversary, as I call it, I was filling out that paperwork as fast as I could, because I wanted to be able to directly thank the man who was responsible for the fact that I wake up every day. And so, so I filled out that information, and then I waited. And a few weeks later, just a couple days before my birthday, I received an email from my care coordinator at my transplant center. The subject line was just, "Happy early birthday." And I opened it up, and there was the contact information for the man who had saved my life. So I quickly sat down and sent him an email and said thank you probably half a dozen different ways, and then waited for a response. As it turned out, I kind of overwhelmed him with my gratitude, and it took him a while to respond because he was like, "I don't know what to do with all this." But ultimately he responded, and we began to correspond a bit. And then after a few years of this, I finally said, "You know what, enough's enough, I have to meet you in person." So we found a weekend that would work for both of us. I flew down to Albuquerque from Salt Lake and started a weekend with him with a great big bear hug, just muttering over and over, "Thank you, thank you, thank you," and weeping all over him. And I got to spend an entire weekend with him and his wife and his new wife and their daughter, and get to know him. And now, in almost a more literal sense, he's like a brother to me. In certain ways, more than my own biological brothers are, because I share his blood. You know, from a blood standpoint, were like identical twins. I often joke that I could go out and commit a murder and he'd get pegged for it. And I'd be out of the country before he could tell the cops that, that it wasn't him and that he has somebody with his blood elsewhere. So I wouldn't kill anyone, I promise. Not even my kids who drive me nuts. Donor commitment is critical. Case in point, when my doctors and I found out that my siblings were not a good match for me to be my marrow donor, they searched the registry to find out if there was anyone on the registry who might be that perfect match that we looked for. As it turns out, there was only one blood sample to come in. And if that one person named Ambrose had not been fully committed when he joined the registry and willing to follow through when he got that call, I would be 6 feet underground right now. And I've also seen patients whose donors have backed out on them too late in the preparative regimen for transplant, to the point where the recipient's immune system is already being killed with the preparative high-dose chemotherapy, and then the donor just doesn't show up to appointments, and it ends with a funeral, and it's beyond devastating. It's far better for a patient to hear their doctor say, "I'm sorry, there's no match for you," than to be filled with hope and that expectation of having a chance at survival, and then having the rug pulled out from under them. And in some cases, when it's too late for there to be any hope of survival, because their blood-making capability in their marrow has already begun to die from the preparative regimen that they've been given. And you can only live off of blood transfusions for so long. And it's awful for their friends and their family. It's awful for their Be the Match representative who's worked with them and seen them be so selfless to share their story. When you've gone through that with somebody and they've been that magnanimous, incredibly selfless person who, in the midst of their own extremity, is looking to help and serve others, and then to see something like that happen, where their donor backs out, it's horrific to be a part of that. When somebody is considering joining the registry, we screen heavily for donor commitment, because we don't want a person to ever be in a situation where they're being given false hope, in a situation where hope is such a precious commodity. So it's critical that a person be willing to call us back if we ever call them, to give a blood sample to see if they're the best match, to keep their contact information up to date. If they're not willing to do that, or if they're iffy about it, I just tell them straight up. I say, you know what, today's not the right day for you to join the registry. And I give them information that they can go home and think about it and learn more, and go to our YouTube channel, go to our website, learn what you need to learn, but please don't join the registry until you know you're in it with both feet. Part of why Be the Match is so active on college campuses is because younger donors are in critical need. Transplant teams always search for the youngest donor available. That's why we stress the 18 to 24-year-old age group, where 80% of marrow donors come from. 80% in that 6 or 7 year time span. 95% of donors are between 18 and 44. That's sort of the core group that we search for. But 18 to 24 is perhaps the most critical group to add to the registry. Because number one, they're more likely to be called upon than any other age group, and number two, they're going to be on the registry for longer than any other age group. We need more students to seriously consider whether or not they would save a stranger's life when and if called upon, when and if given that opportunity. I can't think of a more incredible way to kick off your adult years than to do something that's pretty incredible and pretty heroic. I've joked with my donor, Ambrose, that if he wants to get a great big Superman S tattooed on his chest, I will not only approve of it, I will pay for the darn thing. There's not a day that goes by that I don't thank my lucky stars that a bunch of students held a drive on their college campus in 2009, and that a 25-year-old student said, yeah, I'd save a stranger's life. Because without that, I wouldn't be here. My role as a community engagement representative and the role of the students who work with our Be the Match on Campus Club is to educate, to inform, to invite people to make an educated and informed decision. We never coerce, we never try to convince, we never twist arms, we never tell people they're bad if joining the registry isn't right for them, because frankly it's not right for everyone. It's our job to educate, and it's our hope that people will consider, what if it was me? What if it was my loved one who needed a transplant, and that perfectly matched donor for them was out there somewhere but just not on the registry and available. Ultimately, the message to college students is this: you could be a very personal hero that someone will need someday. But if you are not on the Marrow Donor Registry, you will never know, and they will never survive.